1988. My name is Joe Todd, and this is an interview with Mr. O.G. Henderson in Beaver, Oklahoma. Mr. Henderson, where were you born?
Well, I was born at Grand, Oklahoma, in Ellis County. That's in Ellis County there. At one time, it was the county seat of Old Day County, you see. Not at the time I was born. It had been just a year prior to that, but the county was split up, you know, and made up Day County, and I made up Ellis County and Roger Mills County, and then they had separate.
And when's your birthday?
I was born the 27th of May, 1908.
1980. Why did they split up Old Day County?
Well, Day County was a big county, and it was divided by the Canadian River, which was quite a barrier at that time, you know, and there were no bridges there, and it was just made it a little awkward to get from one part of the county to the other. And see, it split up when statehood came in 1907, and fall of 1907, why it became two counties.
Now isn't Grand a ghost town now?
Yes, Grand is about all you could find would be the old stone vault that they had in the courthouse there. That's about all you could really, the only landmark there is there, I think.
How big was Grand in its heyday?
I was there when I was probably 5 or 6 years old. I remember riding in there with a cousin one day, and there was a square there. There was, I'll just only guess at the population, but perhaps there were a couple hundred people living there. There was a blacksmith shop as usual, and a saloon, and a general store, and a little drugstore. It laid out on a square, and of course it never really filled the square, but then that's the way it was laid out there. Courthouse was right up on quite an abrupt hill where they built the courthouse, and as I say, they built out of native stone an old vault store for safekeeping of records and so forth. And it's just a kind of an arch built out of native stone, and that's still visible there.
And when did Grand finally become a ghost town?
Well, there was a store there until about 1930. I have stopped there. I taught school right in the southeast part of the county when I was just a boy, and there at that time there was just a trail ran down along the river there, and of course we drove our old Model T over that road and went by Grand, and it stopped there for supplies down then. And Mr. and Mrs. Bannister ran the store there. So that was in 1920. Wait a minute, fall of 1927. But I think the store stayed there until about 1930.
Yeah.
I think about that.
Okay. And who is your father?
George Henderson, George T. Henderson.
And your mother?
Grace Thomas was her maiden name.
And where were they from?
Well, oddly enough, toward the last, they both moved to Ellis County along with their parents, really. And my dad was here, I guess, a couple of years before Mother showed up. But they came from, well, at one time they lived in Missouri, not very far from La Plata. You know, people didn't range very wide at that time, and they lived within 20 miles of each other, but the families didn't know each other.
Now, were they born in Missouri?
At that time. Yeah, both of them. Well, my father was born, I'll take that back, my father was born in Chicago, Kansas. But his people lived there in Missouri after that.
Why did the families move to Oklahoma?
Well, of course, there was just homestead land out here, and they just came out for that reason. I had an older uncle who was in the. Well, I had two uncles. One, my father's half brother, older than my father, and then his uncle, his dad's brother, were in the race in '89. And but my dad was, of course, just a kid then, and he came out to Ellis County in 1903, I think it was. Stayed there for a year, and then moved over to the place where our old home is now. And he was yet too young to file on the place, but it was understood. He moved there with his father. He had lost his mother a year previous. Moved there with his father and a younger brother and two younger sisters. They lived on this place that later became his homestead for, I think 2 or 3 years.
There in Ellis County?
Yeah, in Ellis County. Yeah.
And where did you start the school?
At the little country school there called Fairview, at 2.5 miles from my home.
There at Grand?
Well, it was, Grand was still our address, but Fairview was the school there, yes. We didn't move.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what type of work did your father do?
He was farmer and rancher. Yeah, handled cattle there and farmed.
Fairview was it a one-room school?
Yes.
Would you tell me how one teacher handled all the different grades in one room?
Well, it's kind of a mystery. Of course, we know now, and going by today's standards, they really didn't handle them very well. It had some advantages. We sat in there. When I first started school, I suppose there were about 50 children there in the school, seated in the one room, and we had one teacher. His name was Mr. Marshall. He was he'd lived around there for a number of years and had a good reputation as a teacher, and was kind to children and seemed to understand them. But I sat there, Joe, many days and just swung my feet in an old seat that was way too big for me to. Never had a class, Mr. Marshall just couldn't get to it. He didn't have that much time, and he just didn't get to it, so I didn't. I'd go there. I suppose I averaged probably 3 classes out of the 5 days, but I was just, that's the way it was.
What type of house did your parents have when you were born?
Well, we had quite a house. We had a frame house. It was 14 feet square, and it was made out of pine boards, 12-inch, and that's when 12-inch boards were 12 inches. And it was stripped with 2-inch batting, and then every spring my mother would repaper with newspaper, always newspaper. I never remember seeing wallpaper on the inside of our house. It was always newspaper. So we were about that far from freezing weather during the winter. That's the insulation we had, is that newspaper. But we made it fine. I never remember being uncomfortable or feeling like I wasn't living pretty much in luxury. As a kid, we were warm, and we had plenty to eat. And we had a good time, always had a good time.
What chores did you do in the farm as a small boy?
Oh, as soon as I was old enough, and I don't hardly remember when that was. Probably I was 4 to 5. I started helping milk cows, and of course, go see about the cattle. I rode a horse and checked the cattle and that sort of thing. I remember when I was 6, I started driving a team in the field and handling farm machinery. I do remember that.
What types of machinery did you handle?
Oh, cultivators, the old one-row cultivator, it had 2 shovels on each side, and you sat there and held to those handles and tried to plow your crops the best you could with them. And harrow, we used a harrow quite often, quite a bit, and that sort of thing. Or a one-row lister, I drove those, or follow what we called a 5-tooth cultivator. That was just a one-row cultivator thing that we used. And those are the types of machinery.
Did you use horses or mules?
We had both. We had both. Nearly always our better teams were mules.
Why? Why were teams better than horses? The mules better than horses?
Well, they were just tough. They were some way they could stand more. They could do more work on less feed probably than a horse, and they were just tough. That's all.
Ask a question. I've often heard people talk about horse sense, but a mule is much smarter than a horse.
Well, a mule knew how to take care of himself. I'll tell you that.
If you have feed, a horse will eat till he founders.
That's
a
right.
mule won't.
No, that's right. No, they've got pretty good judgment. Yeah.
Tell me, how'd you celebrate the holidays in those years? You know, Christmas, 4th of July, Thanksgiving.
Well, of course, I can distinctly begin to remember my Christmases well, I think the first Christmas I remember distinctly was when I was 7 years old. We had moved from the little frame house at that time, and my dad had built a house sort of in the bank. You'd call it a half dugout these days, I guess. It was set back in the bank, and the back wall and part of the sides was just the walls plastered up, and then the front, we salvaged the lumber out of the old house to build the front of the house, and much bigger than the one we had lived in. And I remember my Christmas there, that's the first Christmas I remember, and we had some sort of a Christmas tree. I doubt if it was a green one. I don't think so, because at that time evergreens didn't grow in our area. But I remember some of the toys we got and all that. And
what toys did you get?
Oh, I got a little brown and white dog that would bark when you hit him on top of the head. He'd bark. And that was, he was pretty special. And then I got a violin. I think I got those two toys. That Christmas I got a toy violin. And I remember right where it was laying when I woke up Christmas morning. It wasn't hanging on a tree, but it was laying there by my bed, all this Christmas spread out, and it was quite a thing. I had 3 sisters younger than me. I'm the oldest one in my family. I doubt if they remember that Christmas at all. They might. My older sister is gone now. We lost her a few years back.
How did that half dugout compare insulation-wise to the frame house?
It was warm enough, but it was far from satisfactory. We didn't, in those days, you see, because of the lack of money, you just simply built it as cheaply as you could, and there was no concrete wall in the back of it or anything. It was just plastered up. And we happened to have quite a rainy summer. That would have been the summer of 1914, and it caved in a time or two. In fact, one time it caved in and covered me up completely. I was sleeping on the bed next to the wall, and they, by digging and pulling the quilts and so forth, well, of course, they got me out. I didn't have any problem, wasn't crippled from it or anything, but I was smothered in a little while. They had to come to the rescue.
What type of furniture did you have in that house?
Most of it was just homemade, set up. We sat, we had, I guess, 3 or 4 chairs, but most of the time it was benches that my dad had made, and they served the purpose. And I remember there was an old rocking chair, kind of the conventional style of the old chairs there that my mother had. I know that too. But most of it was homemade. I remember a little everybody had at that time was called a cook table, and was sat next to the where the stove, close to the old range stove, and it was homemade thing, made out of footboards and probably 2x2s.
What are footboards?
Well, 12-inch board.
12-inch
We commonly called them in those days 12-foot boards, you know, because they were 12 inches wide. And as I say, at that time they were actually 12 inches wide too. And they didn't.
You mentioned the stove. What type of fuel did you burn in the stove?
We burned wood almost all together. Sometimes cow chips, but very, very seldom coal. That was quite a luxury. We had timber there on the place, and sometimes if we didn't have bigger trees that we wanted to cut, my dad was pretty stingy with these good big trees because he was careful about wasting it. Sometimes we'd go to other people who had bigger trees and then cut wood on the halves. Is what we'd saw the wood. We got half the wood, you see, and we'd haul it in, and the owner of the tree got the other half.
And what about your water supply?
We had good water. It was shallow water there. We just went about our well. The first 2 or 3 wells I can remember we had were dug wells with just the old pitcher pump on them, but they were dug about 20 feet deep, but the water stood up about halfway in them. We actually didn't go much over 10 feet till we hit water. See, there were creeks there, 3 creeks right close to the house.
Ever hit any jiffy water?
We didn't. We were lucky. We had good water. Now, east of us, just 5 miles, there they were in the gypsum country, and it was pretty bad. But we had good water.
Do you remember Armistice Day? In 1918.
Oh yes, well enough. Yeah.
Tell me about that day.
Well, there was quite a bit of excitement. I can honestly say that it might have been 2 days later that we learned about it. I don't know. We had a telephone about the time I was about middle teenager in there, 14 or 15 years old. We did get a telephone. But you see, we missed some things. The news didn't travel quite as fast as it does now.
Yeah.
But I remember it was an exciting day, and I did have some relatives in the war and a number of acquaintances in the war. The 2 uncles that I had go to the war, however, yes, the one of them did stay until after Armistice Day, and one of them was dismissed because of health problems and came back. Then I had another uncle who was 18 years old, was in the 18-year-old raft, and he met the train at Higgins, Texas to be shipped out, but they had received word not to load the boys on because the war was over then, or snare, they knew it was going to be, so he never did go.
Do you remember your mother doing any work for the war effort, like wrapping bandages or knitting for the soldiers?
Well, I don't believe it was a big thing with us. Mother had 4 children of her own and quite a little responsibility there. I can remember going to gatherings where they sold war bonds, we called them, and we bought smaller denominations at times, that sort of thing. But actually, Mother, I don't believe it was a common thing in our community. For some reason, maybe just nobody there to push it. I don't know what the reason was, but I don't remember that. It wasn't a big issue.
Yeah, you mentioned the telephone. What do you think you got the first telephone?
Well, of course, that was pretty exciting. We enjoyed it. I remember that my dad thought about it a little before he subscribed. It was just a community thing there, and the fellows built their own telephone line, and we bought our telephones, and we had to pay dues of 50 cents a month, $6 a year for a telephone.
And who had the exchange?
Pardon?
Who had the exchange?
Well, it was about 6 miles from our home at called Camel Exchange. An old gentleman who was paralyzed became our central, and we called it the Camel Switch, and that's where the lines ran in there. And then if we wanted to call Higgins or Arnett, we always had to go through Camel Switch. And Mr. Camel answered and plugged us into where we wanted to go.
Okay. Tell me the first automobile you saw.
Okay, that's sort of interesting. I can well remember the first automobile I ever saw. I was at a public sale. A man by the name of Everett Rector, who had married my father's stepsister, and so we naturally visited a little now and then and so forth. On Sundays, it's customarily you didn't visit much. Only Sundays you did go see somebody, or they came to see you. But anyway, we went there. He had a public sale, and a man by the name of Schofield, Frank Schofield, was a prosperous farmer there. He lived north of us about 5 or 6 miles and had pretty fair farmland there. And he had a Ford. Now I can't say me tell you what model that was. I would guess about a 12. That was close, because I remember how the thing looked. It had the old brass radiator on it at the time. It was a kind of a hectically built thing, and it was the only car there. I know that because the young men, you know, they were all around it, and of course the dash, if you could, you can't imagine being very complicated. It had 3 or 4 little things on it, you know, like I guess I don't even know if it had a choke on it or not. I guess it did, and the switch key, and then the gas feed and the called it the gas and the spark was right up under the steering wheel. See, those 2 levers control that. But I remember seeing the young fellows all standing around there looking at it and talking about it, and they all thought they knew quite a little bit about it. I remember I was probably 4 years old, but I remember it real well, and I know the thing that I remember so well when there was 2 young men there. One was Joe Hunter was one, and the other was Ogie German. Not that matters, but I did know their names, and they were young men, and they had a pretty fancy team and nice harness and the top buggy, and they were there at the sale together, and they got in this buggy and started home, and then Frank cranked this old car up and started right in after they were. And I've often said I probably was the only person in the crowd that wasn't a bit surprised when Frank ran down there and ran into the back of the buggy, because I could see that the car was going faster than the buggy, and I knew they were going to hit, and they did. And Frank couldn't get out of those old sandy tracks, so he just hit the back of the buggy. Well, Joe went out on one side and Ogie on the other and bounced them out. Nobody was hurt. Don't remember that anybody was hurt, but everybody ran down there, and they got up and got back in their vehicle and went on, but it did cause a lot of excitement, a lot of talk, you know, about that car. It was
Now, the flu epidemic of 1918.
Yeah, we were lucky. We pretty well isolated there, you know. We didn't have the flu till 1919, as I recall. We made it through that first winter. We were very careful. We avoided going to gatherings. We did a lot of things that way. My folks were pretty strict about that, and so we didn't. We did. I remember along the 19. Let me see, 16. Yes. Yeah, I would have been about a 3rd grader then. But you know, we had 6 and 7 months terms then, and then. Nobody ever heard of having perfect attendance at school those days, because you were sick or something happens, you couldn't go to school. I never stayed home to work. My dad and mother wouldn't have done that in any manner whatsoever. They were pretty much believed in school, but it was just one of those things that people just didn't go to school, and we turned out commonly for a week now and then, because if there was a kind of an epidemic of any kind, perhaps flu mostly, why, you dismiss school for a week or two and then go back to school. So we didn't actually, the first 5 or 6 years of my school, didn't go to school much, you might say.
And how long did you live there in Ellis County?
Well, I lived there till I was married. I lived there with my dad and mother till, as I say, I taught school. I was 18 when I graduated, and that fall I taught school in the southeast part of Ellis County, and still headquartered at home, of course, came home on weekends. And then I went over Northwestern and went to school that winter, the next winter.
At Alva?
Yes, and got at that time what they called a life certificate. It was, you could get a certificate for, just 1 year's work. So I got that, and then went back to the same little school that I had taught when I got out of high school. And taught there. I stayed down those hills 5 years. In the meantime, I was married, but I lived on the old Ellis County place until I got married.
I was going to ask, how did the Depression affect you and your family?
Well, again, we were pretty lucky people. We knew there was a depression on, of course, and things were rough, but we weren't used to much of anything else. I do remember that I had an uncle who had a sizable family during the Depression, and I remember that, even I was teaching school then, getting a little check each month, and I'd help them sometimes, and my mother and dad helped them sometimes, and these people lived on I had bought a quarter of land when I started teaching school. I got a chance to buy this land and pay part of my salary on it, and I did that, and my uncle lived on my place, and we usually refrained from taking our part of the crop rent because he needed it pretty bad. I remember that, and they not many people actually went hungry, but they sure did without a lot of things they needed. There's no question about that.
What about Black Sunday?
Well,
It was April 14th?
14th, I believe it was on the afternoon. Yeah, that was, of course, in 35. In 1930, the fall of 1935, fall of 1934, I moved out of those hills down the bend of the Canadian River and came up to a school about 10 miles or 8 or 9 miles out of Higgins, Texas, in Oklahoma yet, and I taught that school. And then the next year, which is 35, I got a job in Higgins as one of the teachers there in Higgins. It had 11 or 12 teachers at the time. And I was living in the what was called the old National Hotel there at Higgins when that storm hit. And I remember I was there, we were just kind of sort of loafing around the place on Sunday afternoon. My dad and mother had been up to see us that day and had lunch with us, and they had gone on home early. And it caught them before they got home, and I know they were pretty well panicked. But we had a fellow named Charlie Heckman run the hotel there, and Charlie said, "Well, I've just got a call from Perryton, and they say we've got a black dust storm coming." Well, that wasn't so surprising to us, you see. We knew about it, so we walked out in the street there and watched it roll in, and of course I don't have to tell you how it looked. You've seen a lot of pictures of it. But it just did look like a rain cloud, just black, and it rolled in, and we were standing there, just as calm and beautiful day, had been up till then, and as we could be. And then of course, when that thing, just before it actually hit, I thought, well, I'll go back up to my room. Turned around and went up, and when I got up to the room, it was black. I mean, black. I walked over to the north window and opened the window and just stuck my head out the window. The upstairs windows had no screens on them, and just opened them. And it was just like putting your head in a sack. It wasn't a question of how far you could see. You just couldn't see. And perhaps 5 or 6 minutes before you begin to see the lights across the street and that sort of thing. Not over that. It seemed like a long time, but I'm sure it wasn't over 5 or 6 minutes. And then it began to settle so you could actually see a little. But we were not panicked about it. Well, we did have some Boy Scouts who had gone out to a canyon there about 3 miles from town, and there was a rescue crew went out there after them, and well, I didn't know about it. After the crew had left, I wasn't in the bunch, but they went out there and located the kids. They were in a kind of a cave there and got along fine. No problems. And I don't remember any real problems there, other than people were, of course, pretty concerned about the thing.
Any dust pneumonia?
Yeah, a few cases of that. Yes, it was. I don't remember a death from it. I really don't remember a death from it in our part of the country. But it was pretty rough. It was, of course, better there than it was even up here or around Dalhart and in that area, or Boise City and in there. It was much better than, but it was bad enough there. It blacked us out a lot of times.
World War II.
World War II. I was still a teacher at that time. I had become superintendent of schools at Booker, Texas then. And of course the regulations were that if you were in essential work and your supervisors or bosses or board directors, as the case was, the board of directors in this case, if they wanted to keep you, they'd go to the draft board and say, hey, we'd like to keep this guy. We don't want him. We need him. So my board had gone to the draft board, and I got a deferment for a year. And in my last official, I ran onto an old billfold the other day, still have those cards in it. My last official notice from the draft board was induction postponed till June the 1st, 1946. Well, of course, by that time, the war was so near over that I didn't ever hear it. That was my last word from them.
What about VE and VJ Day? Any celebrations here at that time?
Not too much. Not enough to impress me anyway. Not too much. We, of course, during the war, why I was naturally volunteered to help sell bonds and to take these war films around in the county. I traveled to several different places in the county and put on these shows for people who gathered in a church or a school or something and watched them, you know. That was about, and remember, of course, they had these drives to buy bonds, and we, of course, always, when we could afford it, we'd buy one or two on those drives, and that's...
The tornado, 1947.
Yeah, I remember it real well. We had moved to Beaver in the fall of in August 1946, and that was in the spring of '47 when that hit.
April 9th.
Yes, sir. And my son was 4 years old then. He would have been 5, I guess, in the 12th day of July following that. But he and his mother had gone to Higgins, and my dad, my wife's people lived out 10 miles from Higgins on a farm and ranch there. and she had gone out there, and she and my boy had gone, and I was, of course, had the store here then in Beaver, and that they had come into Higgins to spend the night with her older sister, or they'd come into Higgins intending to come on home, but something caused her to want to stay another. So she called me at the store and said, "I'd like to stay another night and be home tomorrow." Well, that was, of course, a mistake as it turned out, because that's the night the storm came. And the house they were in, there wasn't a splinter of it left, just a hole in the ground where the basement was. And they were carried around in that storm in there part of the time, and then it'd just drop them, and they'd scuff and slide on the street. It was pretty rough. Nobody had a broken bone. No one was killed in my family, but it was a miracle. And I got the word, and of course we had only one car at the time, and I was foot, so I hired a guy to take me, and of course there was very little pavement in the country then, and we had a big rain after that, and we mudded it down there, and I went to Shattuck. I had him take me to Shattuck because I figured that if my family was hurt, which I felt like they would be, that they'd be at Shattuck, which I had no other connection because telephone lines were not working, nothing, you see, but we got the word of it somehow on radio, I guess. And then, so they took me to Shattuck, and I saw an awful lot of people that I knew in the halls there, some lying on cots with their faces covered, and some who were peeled up and beat up from the storm. There were 38 people were killed in Higgins from the storm. But, and I raced around there trying to find my family. Of course, in the excitement, nobody knew where my family was. They were lucky to know where their own family was, you know. So I did finally find one lady, though, an old acquaintance of our family, that said, "I believe your wife's father came in and got them, and I think they're all right. I think they're out there at his ranch." So they had taken refuge in an old cellar that was cobwebby, and nobody had been in for 10 years, I'm sure, but they were in there, and my wife's sister's husband he was uptown, but he had finally got home, and I think he's the one that took them, put them in this cellar, and they were taking out the ranch then. And I didn't actually get out there. I went to Shattuck. Well, this guy had to be back home and go to work the next morning, so I was there. I was afoot again in Shattuck. Well, my brother-in-law happened to be a funeral director, and he had gone to Shattuck to help Carl Mason, who was a funeral director there, with the bodies. There was such a tremendous bunch of them coming in, and he had a car, and he let me have the car, and I drove out the range there, and I got there 5 o'clock in the morning and found my family in, well, not in good shape, but in better shape than they might have been.
How far were they carried to the air by the tornado?
Well, they were, probably 300 yards from their house.
Did your wife remember all that?
Oh yeah. She never lost consciousness.
I think we're going to talk to her about that, because that's one of our areas.
I'd like you to. She had first-hand experience there. Yeah, I don't want to relive that night, Joe. That was something else. I mean, the anxiety and the wondering what in the world had happened and all that for
not knowing
so many hours, you know, was. I don't want to go through that again.
Did you come to Woodward after that? To help out?
I was in Woodward, yes, sometime after that. I was in Higgins mostly because, I mean, when I could help a little, I'd go there because, you know, people I knew were there.
What did you do to help out?
Oh, we'd take in food, and we took blankets, and we took, I think in some cases maybe a little cash contribution at times, and we knew, see, I had been in the principal of the Higgins School there for 6 years, and I knew a lot of people there, and it hadn't been really that long ago, and so we felt pretty well obligated to that. That's really what we did.
And why did you move to Beaver?
Well, I was I'd bought into the little drug chain, B&J, and very shortly after that, we lost a manager here in Beaver, and I came over actually for a few days to run this store.
And when was this?
1946, on the 8th day of August in 1946. They tossed me the keys to the little store down there on the 8th of August in 46. And I've been here since, and I don't regret it. I've had a good life in Beaver, and I've got lots of friends I feel like I have, and I like the people here real well, and I managed to make a living, you know, and worked with other businessmen, and that was half the fun of living, I think, really, was working on civic work and that kind of thing, you know. Well, it's just been a good life as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, could you relate some of the stories the old timers told you about Beaver, the early days?
Yeah, there's one story that stuck in my mind that happened to affect our last several years pretty well, I guess. We were in a meeting at Chamber of Commerce meeting, and I happened to be on a committee to try to work out something in the way of a Cimarron Territory celebration out here. And we finally got brave enough. It had been in connection with the fair for a number of years, and we finally said, let's pull it away from the fair and have it in the spring, have a separate celebration, because it lost its identity in the fair. See, people talk about the fair, but they didn't know there was a Cimarron Territory celebration. And so we sat in that meeting that night, and the printer, who's Willis Lanson, who is gone now, and Jim Lyle, who was in the First National Bank at that time, and Ralph Rector, who later became our chamber manager for years, for several years, 12 years I think, and myself. We talked this thing over, and we, and one of the stories that was always of interest to me is how we got into this cow chip thing. They said, well, in the early day, that people came here. You see, at one time, Beaver was kind of see the old 168-mile strip here, and they came in here, and it got to be a kind of a social thing as well as court, because men came in, brought their families. They camped down on the meadow there, and the court would last a week, 10 days, and they just camped here till it was over. And they said, for want of something better to do, they got throwing cow chips down there on the meadow. Well, we talked about it a little bit, and finally somebody, I don't know which one in the crowd mentioned, said, well, why don't we had decided on some old sack race, half a dozen silly things that they do, and gatherings that way, you know, for entertainment, and grease pig, catching a grease pig, and this and that. And finally somebody said, well, I don't want to throw cow chips. Well, okay, yeah, we'll do that. We're going to throw horseshoes and cow chips, and we're going to do that. So Jim Lyle, who was the official in the old First National Bank, said, well, I'll take that. I'll get out there. We staked a little place right here on the fairground, out here in the open. Put old Jim out there, and they about trampled him to death. I'll tell you, everybody was so excited they wanted to throw cow chips. Everybody did. Well, we had gone into it without the least organization or anything else. We just throw cow chips. We supposed there might be a half a dozen show up. Instead of that, there were 100 of them, I guess. They just really gathered in there. Well, we saw then it had made quite a hit, so we started working on that and making it our, well, we didn't have to make it our number one event. The public did that.
What year was this?
Sir?
What year was this?
I didn't understand.
What year was
Oh,
this?
that was in 1970.
Mhm.
I think I'm right. I think we may have had one meeting in it's been 69. Now, I ought to have reviewed that before I tried to talk to you. It was in 69 or 70. But then, from there on, of course, I have often said that the Cimarron Territory, again, lost its identity because people don't talk about the Cimarron Territory celebration, they talk about the cow chip throw now, so it lost its identity again. But anyway, that was interesting to me, and I could sort of imagine the situation and the way people went about it and camped in there on the river and all. It sounded like kind of a peaceful way to live and all. So those people had that way of enjoying themselves probably more than people do today.
This Jim Lane, is that his name?
Yes. Jim Lane, James Lane, was the first settler in here. Jim Lane built that old log cabin that houses, the first museum we had here, and it's still called Beaver Museum, and the lady keeps it open down there. It's quite a few things in there to see, all right, but it isn't very well attended anymore because it isn't well advertised.
Now, is that his cabin that she's
Yeah,
in?
that's it. That's it.
How old was that cabin?
It was built in, I think, 1881.
And how far from the original position is it now? Was it on the
It's
original
sitting
site?
exactly where it was.
Oh,
It's the
so
same. It's right there.
Okay.
It's been added to, and of course it has been stuccoed over. The only way you can tell it was sod is by, chipping in through that stucco and that plaster. But that's it. And
It's a log cabin, you say?
no, it was a sod.
Oh, the sod house.
Sod house.
Oh, it's sod.
It's sod house,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
There wasn't a log in it that I recall, but it was
Oh.
sod, and it happened to be pretty well built and pretty good straight walls and everything. But they did plaster that, and it is a part of the old house there. Of course, it's been built onto, and it's probably double the size it was. But my understanding is that Jim Lane built that for his home, and then he also had served a little food there and had a saloon there, of course. They had
Why
a
did he
standard.
settle here?
The story is that he sort of looked the geography of the country over, and the old trails, cattle trails, Jim thought would come through here because this is a pretty good place to cross the river, and there were no high embankments here or anything, and so he just felt like this would be the place to settle, and I think, of course, I doubt if he had any idea of starting a town, but he had his own business there, and he had a service pulling people back and forth across the river, and he did all the things that the pioneers did naturally at that day and time, and he served quite a purpose because it became quite a stopping place for the cattlemen and so forth. Because we didn't, you couldn't stop just every few miles. There was some cases, no water, and in a lot of cases, no food available or corrals available or anything. But I understand he did have corrals for the cattle and that sort of thing, and kind of set himself up for the business.
Why the name Beaver County and Beaver City?
My guess is that, and it is a guess that I think it's a good guess, but the river is Beaver River, and I think it was named for the river, and of course Beaver City, it was quite natural to call it because it was by far the biggest settlement in the whole 168-mile strip here, and it was officially called Beaver City. That was changed officially, I believe, at statehood, Joe.
Yeah.
I believe it was changed then, but before that it was officially Beaver City.
Any of the old timers? Did you know Jim Lane?
No, he was gone. Way before I came here. Yeah, he was gone.
Who were some of the old timers that you did know?
Well, let me see. I knew Tom Judy. His widow still lives here. I think you've met Mrs. Judy.
Yeah, we've interviewed him.
And yeah, you interviewed Tom. Well, I used to visit with Tom a lot in the store when he was here. A lot of those people were gone, and of course I knew probably more of the old time ranchers and so forth in the edge of Texas down there than did in Beaver, because by the time I got up here in 1946. There's been a lot of changes made. I did know Otto Barbie Sr., however, and would have been at his home at parties and that kind of thing.
What kind of man was he?
He was something else. He was quite a strong character, a man who came out here as just a kid and believed in this country and started getting hold of this land, and he was a good operator. He had, they tell me, hi.
Okay, Otto Barbie.
Oh yes. They tell me, Joe, that one of the remarkable things about him, well, he had a lot of remarkable points, but they would send, Mr. Barber would be coming into town, and they would need a list of groceries, and he'd usually managed to drive by the different places of the people who worked for him and his sons who lived in some house out on the range, and they'd tell him what they wanted, and he never took a written bill or never took notes. He just put it up here, and they said it was surprising what he could do. And they told him they wanted beans and flour and salt and pepper. Well, that's what they got, and he ruled with a kind of a strong hand. It was all under one fence, the ranch was, and when he had a son who grew up and was an operator, well, he just simply, he had a house someplace else, but they all reported to father, and then I understand that they had a settlement once each year, and everybody got his fair share. Nobody unhappy in that respect at all. But he was quite an executive. He really was.
When did he come to this territory?
When did he come? I know it was before. I'm sorry, Joe, that I don't know that. I wish I did, but I'm sure it was before the turn of the century. He settled in here. There was another old family here that were, I understand, here before Barbie's were. The Healy Ranch is a well-known ranch here. In fact, there's some Healy money in this addition we put in here. The grandson of the lady whose estate was settled recently, and we got a little piece of the money, was here when we dedicated this museum, and he was one of our guests of honor. And but Barbie was here, I understand, soon after the Healys came in, before the turn of the century, I'm sure.
Was Cimarron Territory ever organized?
No, sir.
No.
They tried real hard, and but it really wasn't. They went to a man by the name of O.G. Chase, who in 1886 they had their first meeting, and incidentally, it's in that old building I'm overhauling right now. Not the same building, but on the same lot. And that's where the Capitol was. They had their meeting there in 1886, and then again in 1887 they sent O.G. Chase to Washington, D.C. to try to gain recognition, but he didn't get it done. And of course, the movement for statehood was on pretty, after a while, and they never did get it done. It was organized into territory pretty soon, but never got Cimarron territory off the ground. It was attempted, but that was all.
Now, where is the lot here in Beaver? The city.
Where the old Capitol was?
Yeah.
It's well marked, Joe. It has the stone down there. It's on Douglas Avenue, which is our main street.
It is marked then.
Yes, and straight across the street from the Bank of Beaver City. It happens I own the building, and this stone showing the old trails and everything is on the front of that building.
Now, I heard here recently that there was a move on to make the state a panhandle.
Oh, that,
Was that
Joe,
ever a serious
ever since I can remember, that has been talked to make the two panhandles have talked about, combining and making a state out here. I think it's far from a possibility. I think it is. I think that's talk. I think most of we Okies like to be Okies, and I think we Texans like to be Texans, and I think we're pretty happy like it is. We kind of complain, have a reputation of being complainers out here because of sometimes we feel forgotten, but I think that's changed too some in recent years. I feel like that we have had our share of the attention, and there have been some changes made. Maybe as a result of us crying around about it. I don't know. Maybe that did help, but that I feel like we get our just dues. I don't think we're being left out.
The origin of this museum. When was this museum organized and built?
In 1969, there were several clubs in the county, as there are in most counties, sewing clubs, you name it. There were, a bunch of different clubs, and they largely, I feel, through the efforts of Bernice Jackson, they had a meeting, they got together, they organized, out of those clubs, they organized the present Historical Society. Beaver County Historical Society was organized there, and that's where it had its beginning. It's from these clubs, and there's a pretty good account of that in the preface of this her first history book here, and then of course they wound up creating the 2 volumes, which I'm pretty proud of. Not that I had anything to do with it, but our people did, and they did a whale of a job. I think they did a whale of a job. At least we have been consulted a lot of times on how we did it and what we did, and our books are pretty well known over the state.
Anything we haven't covered yet that you want to mention?
Oh, no, I don't, Joe. I don't think I'd have anything that would be very interesting to anybody for that matter.
I was going to ask, you know anything about trying to raise the water table again? I've heard this talk about that. The water table's been dropping over the years.
Yes.
I heard there's a move to try to get the water table back up.
I have to say I haven't been active in those meetings. I have gotten notices sometimes of the meetings and so forth. I'm not really current with it. I don't know. Yes, I know there's some effort, all right. I do know that. And of course, we both know that there's far less irrigation now than there was. So I assume that we're gaining some. If we're not, we should be, because we're not pumping the water out of the ground we were. And not maybe because we're so dedicated, but because gas got too high to pump it, So maybe it was it was a blessing in disguise. I don't know. Maybe it was.
Well,
That's what happened.
I think we have a good interview right now, but maybe I'd like to do a follow-up later on.
Okay, Joe. Okay.
Because I'd like to come in and get more information on the museum itself.
Yes, yes.
And,
Okay. Well, I've enjoyed talking with you. As I say, I know some of the old timers right here in the territory are much more knowledgeable about what went on here than I am, because I came in pretty late in 1946. But I have associated with a good
but
many
you're
of
the
them.
first person I've talked to from Old Day County.
Is that so?
Yep.
Is that so? Yes, sir. Well, I'll say.
So we cover the history of Oklahoma, everything.
Yeah, yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank you.
Well, Joe, thank you.